Hi, my name's David. I work at the Noble Public Library. This year's summer learning theme is Imagine Your Stories, Fairy Tales, Mythology, and Fantasy. And we here at the Pioneer Library System thought it would be kind of fun to dig into exactly what makes up these literary genres. And that's exactly what we're doing in this series of videos. We're going to look at all of these genres of fairy tales, fantasy, mythology, folklore, dig into their history, why they're important, and provide some reading recommendations. So, what are fairy tales? It's a good question. Fairy tale is a genre of folklore that includes stories that have such things as, and this is where I have to read because it's a slightly long list, dwarves, dragons, elves, fairies, giants, gnomes, goblins, griffins, mermaids, talking animals, trolls, unicorns, witches, and magic or enchantments. Also often they are short stories aimed at children. So as with almost every type of folklore, fairy tales started in the oral tradition. They were stories that were passed down for hundreds of years in many cases before eventually being written down. Now some of these stories go all the way back to the Bronze Age. That's 6,500 years ago. Now, eventually some of these stories were written down and made their way into the literary tradition. The term fairy tale itself goes all the way back to 1697 when it appeared in a collection of stories. Even though these stories are often associated with Western Europe, they actually come from all over the place and predate the Middle Ages. For example, there are stories that go back to the Roman Empire in the 2nd and 3rd century CE. There are stories that go back to 3rd century BCE in India, the 5th century BCE in China, and then all the way back to the 6th century BCE in Greece. That's a long time ago. So we kind of have an idea. These are stories about magical creatures and magic and different things, and they all deal with, generally they're stories for kids. And you would think, okay, that sounds pretty simple, right? It's not. One of the really fascinating things about fairy tales is how much argument over what is and is not a fairy tale has happened over the years between scholars and linguists and people a lot smarter than me. Case in point, there's something called the Arne-Thompson-Uther Index, which is a catalog of folktale types. It's something that started in 1910 by a Finnish folklorist. It was then updated in 1928 and again in 1961 by an American folklorist, and then updated yet again in 2004 by a German folklorist. So what it is, it's a catalog of all of these different types of tales where things are issued a number based on what happens in the story. So without getting too deep into the weeds of all this, because nobody's got time for that.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
You had scholars ranging from the Russian folklorist Vladimir Propp to the English academic philologist and author J.R.R. Tolkien, all disagreeing on exactly what constitutes a fairy tale. So much to the point that Tolkien argued that stories that had fairies weren't actually fairy tales. So what does all this really mean? So, for one thing, there is not any one specific set, all-encompassing definition of what it is to be a fairy tale. Much like beauty, it's really in the eye of the beholder, or like a Supreme Court justice once said, I know it when I see it. Even though that there's all this disagreement, there are sets of commonalities, themes, motifs, character types, archetypes that do appear in fairy tales across the board. Now, these include such things as magic and magical creatures, princes and damsels in distress, fairy godmothers, evil stepmothers or stepmonsters, and so on. A couple of final tidbits before we get into some of our reading recommendations. Remember earlier how I mentioned that so much of fairy tales in the Western idea of it stems from Western Europe and the Middle Ages? Well, a lot of elements from these stories actually come from pre-Christian European religions. Great example, the leprechaun from Ireland.
I'm the leprechaun.
The leprechaun's origins go all the way back to the Celtic god of knowledge and patron of the arts and crafts. And I'm going to mispronounce this because, I'm not Irish, unfortunately. Luch Lamfada. One other neat note, before the advent of fantasy as a literary genre, which we'll get to in a future video, stories and books such as J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, George Orwell's Animal Farm, they were all labeled as fairy tales. All right. Now that we know a little bit about fairy tales and where they come from and what they are, let's dive into some reading recommendations. So our first two reading recommendations aren't as much books as they are works that are synonymous with the fairy tale. The first is the works of the Brothers Grimm. Brothers Grimm were one of the first early and most important collectors of fairy tales. Now, their book, Grimm's Fairy Tales, or at the time it was known as Children's and Household Tales, was first published in December of 1812. This thing included 86 stories. Now, by the time they did the 7th edition of the book, which came out in 1857, by that point, it contained over 210 unique stories. So the thing about the Brothers Grimm is they collected these stories, edited them, revised them many times over the years, obviously for over 50 years. So in a way, you could say that the Brothers Grimm Disney-fied these stories before Disney. Okay, our second reading recommendation is the works of a gentleman named Charles Perrault. Now, Charles predates the Brothers Grimm. He was a French author who published his book, Tales and Stories of the Past with Morals, Tales of Mother Goose, in 1697. The important thing about Perrault is he is often credited as the founder of the modern fairy tale genre. And our final reading recommendation is our modern reading recommendation, and that is the Spiderwick Chronicles series by Tony DiTerlizzi and Holly Black. Now, this series follows 3 children after they have moved into the Spiderwick estates, where they learn that there is this whole new world of fairies and magical creatures that they'd never imagined it actually existed. Now, while Mr. Tolkien might argue that because there are fairies in this story, it doesn't actually constitute a fairy tale, that's not an argument I'm willing to have. The series was originally released as a 5-book series between the years of 2003 and 2004 and is incredibly fun and endearing and perfect for all ages. I almost selected Fablehaven by Brandon Mull as my choice for the modern fairy tale pick, and it's an excellent book, don't get me wrong. But I went with the Spiderwick Chronicles because since fairy tales are so often associated with stories for children, I wanted to make sure to pick a story and a book or a series that really is completely appropriate for all ages, and that is the case with Spiderwick Chronicles. All right, that's going to do it for today. Make sure that you head over to pioneerlibrarysystem.org to check out all the great things we have going on at your local hometown library, and make sure to follow us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. We've got tons of great virtual content for you there, videos just like this on all sorts of great subjects. We appreciate you taking your time joining us today. My name is David, and I hope everyone out there stays safe, stays healthy, and I hope to see you real soon. Take care.